Good afternoon and welcome again, if you haven't been welcomed already, to the University of Vermont's 25th Anniversary Legal Issues in Higher Education Conference. I want to welcome those of you who are here live as well as those who are watching at home to this afternoon's session, which is entitled Campus Diversity and the Return of Fisher versus the University of Texas to the U.S. Supreme Court. Our presenter for today's session is Art Coleman, who is the founding and managing partner of Education Counsel, a subsidiary of the law firm of Nelson, Mullins, Rowley, and Scarborough. In the speaker bios, you'll see a more detailed description of Art's expertise and experience. I'll refer you to that, but point out simply a few of the many highlights. Art served as a high-ranking official in the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights during the Clinton administration, starting around 1994 to about 2000. His work then and since then has been focused almost entirely on education law and policy, that is, improving outcomes and access for students at all levels. We're especially lucky to have Art here today to talk about the Fisher case. We're lucky to have him at all. He's been working feverishly over the last days or weeks, including this weekend, and probably right after the session ends, back to work, writing an amicus brief for the U.S. Supreme Court case, the Fisher case. He wrote one for the first Fisher case, too, a few years back. This time, his brief will be on behalf of four national education organizations, the College Board, with whom he's had a long-standing association, the National Association of College Admissions Counselors, ACRO, which is, of course, the Registrars and Admissions Officers Organization, and LSAC, the Law School Admissions Counselor. Law School Admissions Council. All these groups obviously have extremely high interest in the Fisher case and its outcome. There's probably no better person at this moment, better equipped to address these issues than Art Coleman. He's going to talk probably for roughly 40, 45 minutes, maybe until around 2 o'clock or so. And then we'll break and leave the rest of the time for questions and answers. So, without further ado, Art Coleman.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon. Glad to be here. Looking forward to a good conversation on some very thorny issues that are making their way back to the Supreme Court. I am going to reserve a lot of time for question and answer because I think this is likely to be actually the most fun part of the afternoon of this session. But if there's something that's not clear as I'm going through some baseline points, please don't hesitate to stop and let me know. So let me tell you the 5 things I want to do in the next 45, 50 minutes. Give you some very quick policy and legal baselines that set the stage for the discussion of the Fisher case. I want to briefly unpack Fisher, what we know after the Supreme Court's decision in round 1. Talk a little bit about stage 2 for Fisher, which is, in my opinion, remarkably different than stage 1. Give you then some practice pointers regarding ways to think about operationalizing some of the Supreme Court and other federal legal rules regarding diversity policies and practices on campus stemming from years of work. When you first said Clinton, I was immediately thinking Hillary, and then you said Bill, and I realized how old I am. And then I want to round it out just to make sure you've got the full complement of resources. I think these materials will be downloadable, and they all have website links to them, but there's a really good library of information at your disposal that should be useful to you. So let's start first with some legal and policy baselines. This is nothing but a quick timeline to get us grounded in what the present day reality is. In the storyline here, I'm not going to go through all of these cases in detail, although you will recognize the names of many, beginning with the core K-12 discrimination cases that yielded some higher ed cases, and then Bakke and Grutter and Gratz, the K-12 case in 2007, Hicks, involving student racial assignment. I'll come back and talk about that a little bit. It's important because Justice Kennedy, just to throw out the punchline, is the only justice any of us cares about right now on this issue. So we are writing our briefs for him and only him. A little tongue-in-cheek, but almost true. And then, obviously, the Fisher case. And I think the storyline here fundamentally is this, that while the origins of quote-unquote affirmative action, I'm going to come back to that term as well, are remedial and grounded in notions of social justice fundamentally, that the present regime and the present lens by which the court blessed limited race-conscious practices in Gratz and Grutter, reaffirmed it in Hicks in a different way, and then reaffirmed it again in Fisher 2 years ago, is about a mission-oriented, forward-looking education set of goals. It is not about remedying past wrongs. It is not about doing justice and saving the world. Is it about the mission-focused educational rationale that an institution can drive and thrive? And that doesn't mean you are operating in a vacuum. It doesn't mean you are not connected to society at large. But there is a big line of difference between the kind of cases that the court has rejected when they've come up saying we're saving the world, and the court will, in essence, say, who are you to save the world, versus I'm here to do my job educationally and I need diversity on campus to do that, to meet my mission-oriented goals. That's where institutions get the limited deference the court gives, and that's where the court has blessed some race-conscious practices. So this is Federal Non-Discrimination Law 101 in one slide. I hope you appreciate the effort. Strict scrutiny is the standard, and it is simply posing two questions. Anytime there is a policy or practice and a student, and we're talking only students here, I'm not talking faculty, I'm not talking staff. That's a whole nother world, and it's even harder than what I'm talking about today on students. So for students in institutions, public or private, the rule is if you are making judgments that confer a material benefit or opportunity to some student and not another, where race is an influence in that decision-making, you've got to be able to answer these questions. As the court has said, strict in theory is not fatal in fact, but it's a tough process to get through. Is it doable? Absolutely. Institutions have succeeded in passing the Supreme Court's test before, and I work with institutions on a daily basis that are rolling up their sleeves to do the heavy lifting here. So it's quite achievable, but it requires some heavy lifting and work. But this is only with respect to those policies and practices associated with diversity that have a race or ethnicity element to them and some material benefit or opportunity for some students and not others. And so the first point is, for those kinds of practices like race-conscious admissions or a race-exclusive scholarship or a summer program where someone's coming in for a 2-week, here's how to be a student at the University of X, all expense paid based on race, you've got to have a very, 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 very good reason for doing it. And what the court has said is, under that legal threshold, the educational benefits of diversity will suffice. In Grutter and Gratz, it expanded on Justice Powell's Bakke opinion and basically said the educational benefits of diversity could be grounded in improved teaching and learning, preparation for a 21st century workforce, and preparation for civic readiness. Those core values as an institutional, remember, educational foundation can serve to frame whatever your particular institutional diversity interest is. So you've got Justice Powell and Bakke, you've got majorities of the Supreme Court in Grutter and Gratz, cases that went in different directions but upheld the proposition that the benefits of diversity were compelling. And you've got 7 justices on the court in Fisher 2 years ago saying, we will reaffirm at this point. That's the why. You've also got to be able to establish, if you've got that very good reason, you then have a program design that is well crafted and tailored to meet those goals. With as limited, this is challenging, this is threading the needle, with as limited a use of race as is possible while still having material impact from the use of race that you're using. So it sounds almost contradictory, but the court is on the one hand saying we don't want an over-reliance on race, but we better see some impact from the use of race. If you can't actually pass either of those thresholds, you're probably dead in the water. So the 4 questions are necessity, flexibility, adverse impact, and then periodic review, which is a process element. You'll see here the question of flexibility and minimum adverse impact really went to the core distinction between upholding the law school policy in Grutter and striking down an undergraduate policy in Gratz, where the court said, law school, you've got really authentic individualized review. You're not weighting race as a factor. You're looking at Johnny's application and saying, wow, in light of your life experience, I see how race has affected it, and I'm considering that in the way I value your application. That's different than the check mark 20 points because you're African American, which the undergraduate institution was pursuing. So that was the distinction, and this is where fundamentally even the court talked about all these factors in Grutter, and most of them in Gratz. The focus of the real distinction between the 2 cases centered on this question of holistic, individualized review. Hicks is not a higher ed case. It is a K through 12 case from 2007. Its parents involved in community schools, involved 2 race-conscious student assignment practices that were quite mechanical and rough, to use a legal term. Among the many things that the court didn't like about those practices, one was the fact that they yielded very little impact. They were pretty significant race-conscious practices, and in one of the school districts, it changed the yield in student assignment by something like 3%. And in another very large district, it upped the number of students who were getting an opportunity by 30 or 40, something in that range. So minimal impact. And the court basically said, for that kind of impact, if you're going to use a disfavored tool, you've got to go back to the drawing board. So while the question of impact hasn't sort of fully surfaced in a higher ed context, there were echoes preceding Hicks, and I think Fisher begins to sort of surface that, at least implicitly, and we'll see whether that comes back to the fore in this round. And then 2 years ago, Fisher, and it talked about a number of issues, but the big one, the big point of focus, where can you get 7 justices to agree on anything, let alone in the arena of affirmative action, the court came together and said, lower court, you did not do your job in applying the strict scrutiny standard. You didn't ensure that the University of Texas actually undertook race-conscious practices only if necessary to achieve their goals in light of the benefits of the top 10% plan that was there. So that's basically your Law 101. That is the big picture on what we know right now from the Supreme Court on strict scrutiny. Let me just stop there for a second. Any quick questions? Anything not clear? Okay. So let's talk for a minute about Fisher. Ms. Fisher was an applicant to the University of Texas at Austin, denied admission, and she was denied under an admissions policy that was made up of both the top 10% law and an academic and personal achievement indices that were a complement to the operation of that law. What basically had happened, the old-timers in the room will remember 1996 in Hopwood, where the Fifth Circuit struck down temporarily the consideration of race for the benefits of diversity, saying that that was not consistent with Supreme Court jurisprudence. The court in the Michigan cases subsequently rejected that viewpoint. But for a period of time, Texas was without the tool in the toolbox of considering race in admissions or in other academic arenas based on that Fifth Circuit ruling, which was controlling only for the Fifth Circuit. And so legislators got together and said, we have got to do something to ensure that the University of Texas is appropriately diverse. And they established the top 10% plan, which basically said, if you're in the top 10% of your high school graduating class, guaranteed admission, period, no questions asked. That resulted in about an admissions, as you see here, of about 80% of the entering class being admitted under that law. So the admissions office, in terms of their actual holistic review, only had the pool of the remaining 20% to decide. So that's sort of one feature that makes this very different than any other case under the sun, because we don't have a top 10% plan anywhere else. The other reason this law was actually arguably, and I think in some ways was so successful, is the K through 12 system in Texas is highly segregated. So by operation, a top 10% law means you're going to get a lot of racial diversity. And guess what? By 2007, I think, or so, their underrepresented minority population was up to 20 to 25% of the total student body population. That's not insignificant, especially if you look back to see what Michigan was arguing for in Grutter, saying we need race to get to 11 to 17%. Now, if you took the numbers and stopped, as the plaintiffs in the case would have you do, then the plaintiffs probably win, or at least arguably so. Because on pure, simple numbers, Texas already exceeds what Michigan was simply trying to get, and there's critical mass is a social science concept. It's not a sort of legal term. But when you hit the 20 to 25% mark, you're sort of in the zone. I think the difference is that critical mass isn't just a purely quantitative measure. It is ultimately a question about critical mass for what? What educational ends are you trying to achieve? And so Texas has made the case that despite the fact that they were at a 20+% underrepresented minority student status at some point with their race-conscious policy, there still wasn't sufficient critical mass in certain ways in the institution back to the educational goals for them to achieve the results they were trying to achieve. So I think you can see, given the composition of the court, an uphill battle for Texas, but one that can actually be authentically waged, and it's the fight they're making. So that's the sort of scenario in a nutshell that then gave us the first opinion that I think fundamentally did two things with some overtones on the third. The first is, and I frankly think operationally it didn't tell us anything we sort of didn't already know or shouldn't have already known. That when you're evaluating race-conscious policies and practices to ensure they conform to this strict scrutiny regime, you had better be looking hard at race-neutral practices as well. Because to be able to establish the necessity for the race-conscious, I've got to show I've made a really good effort on race-neutral and it's not been successful. It's a pretty logical model if you step back from the legal muck and actually think about what the court is saying. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of the details. Some of the resources I've got will give you all the cites and interpolation of what Kennedy really meant or what he should have thought he meant when he was saying what he said. But the bottom line is more rigor, more thought, more inventory focus around race neutral. It's not just enough to say, I've got some race conscious policies, I'm going to look at those really long and hard. You've got to expand horizons there. I also think, and this percolates from the Picks case as well, the court said it's not just enough to have nice policies on the books. What are the effects of your policies in practice? What is this apparently well-articulated policy actually getting you in terms of yield? Are you actually achieving your goals? In what way? How do you know? Roll up your sleeves and get to work. That's the message from the court. And much to my amazement, this question of critical mass got no attention at all in the Fifth Circuit in the first round. I was stunned because it was 80% of the oral argument. My theory is that Kennedy and the court were as smart as Justice O'Connor in Grutter, who gave critical mass the attention of 3 lines in the entire opinion. They completely punted, which I think is translated into, this is really hard stuff and we have no idea. And so we're going to avoid the question at all costs. Whether that is actually possible this go-around is another question. We'll get back to that in a minute. But it is nonetheless a very real question, an issue, as you'll see, as a matter of policy planning. So it's not one to ignore in this context, whether the court in Fisher takes it up squarely or not. So let's put this opinion in context. In other settings, as you may have read, Justice Roberts likes incrementalism. He has an agenda by many accounts, but he's not coming slashing and burning all at one fell swoop. And so while the important sort of quote-unquote victory to savor out of Fisher was the fact that the Grutter regime remained fundamentally in place with a couple of modifications in articulation, there are some hints in the language that forebode stormy clouds. And so let me just give you some contrast. This is Justice O'Connor in Grutter talking about, with some passion, to the extent you can derive that from the page, the substantial, important, and laudable educational benefits of diversity that are substantial and real, citing not only to the educational research, but to the Fortune 500 companies and other businesses that filed briefs that said diversity was an essential element of the business enterprise and economic development, and the briefs of the former military generals and ranking officers who said national defense depended on having a corps with officers who were diverse. My theory of that case is that she ruled that way because she's the equivalent of my hypothetical Republican grandfather, who would look at educational research and say, you can do anything with statistics. I'm not necessarily buying it, but you package the educational research with the economic positions of corporations that are living and breathing this day and day, and then you add national defense, it becomes a much more compelling case. So she's pretty enthusiastic about this and seems to authentically get it, citing to lots of authorities. Justice Kennedy, who's actually on the record in this Picks case, it's worth reading, his concurrence, is recognizing the value and power of race. He does not believe, in fact, he has said point blank, we are not living in a colorblind society and we're fooling ourselves if we think we can get away with pretending to live in a colorblind society. So he rejects that, I think, to his credit, right out. But note, he's raising the prospect of whether the Grutter decision was actually correctly decided, but it's not a question the court was forced to face, and so he passes on that. Kennedy, as you may recall, the Grutter decision was a 5-4 decision with Justice O'Connor writing the majority opinion. Kennedy dissented, but he dissented separately as the only dissenter to say, I disagree with the application to the facts, I would strike down the law school policy, but I would uphold the principle of limited race-conscious practices to support the educational benefits of diversity. So he is not as far right, to use a term that's not terribly descriptive, as some of the others on the court. And on this question of means, remember we talked about ends and means earlier. Justice O'Connor on narrow tailoring said you got to look hard, but you don't have to look at pursue every conceivable neutral alternative. You need good, serious good faith consideration of alternatives. And we'll take the law school at its word that it really worked hard here, but didn't get what it needed. And this is the big one where I think you see sort of nothing in line with O'Connor except the ostensible sort of quote of words with different emphasis. Narrow tailoring does not require exhaustion of every conceivable race-neutral alternative. You can hear Kennedy saying that. It's emphasis in the original. Consideration by the university is necessary but not sufficient. The parties don't challenge and the court doesn't consider the correctness of Grutter, again raising the prospect of whether Grutter was on the facts correctly decided. And then he talks about the burden on the university. So even though he's fundamentally adopting and continuing the regime of Grutter and Gratz, there is an underlying tone and an evolution in the questions and the articulation of what he's looking at. And frankly, one piece that squarely comes from his dissent in Grutter that now the majority picks up is we hear a lot of times academic freedom bandied about a lot. It's not a guarantee of anything, and it's not an absolute, but there is limited deference that the court has historically given in these cases. He is now very operationally clear. You get some limited deference when you're defining your mission and when you're defining your goals. Remember, back to lesson 1, in educational terms. But when you switch from goals to means and you start talking about the mechanics of what you're doing to achieve those goals, no deference. I am giving you as much probing scrutiny as I possibly can. So that's an important, very sort of clear line that was sort of on the surface in Grutter, but didn't make its way until squarely the Fisher case. So let me stop there for a second. And that's Fisher in a nutshell, round 1. Any questions? Okay, now, Fisher 2 on the horizon. Fisher has already filed her merits brief. The University of Texas merits brief is due at the end of this month. Amicus briefs, which take me back to Washington tonight, are due on November 2nd. Oral argument in early December. And you heard it here first, guaranteed. The decision will come down on the last day of the term in June. It always does when it's an affirmative action case. So we'll see if that pattern holds. Interestingly, when the court sent the case back down, there was some argument about whether the Federal Circuit Court should send it back down to the trial court. This is a case that was decided on cross summary judgment motions. And without getting into all of the procedural underpinnings, the Fifth Circuit denied remand back to the district court. So it is factually the identical record that was before the court in round 1 is now before the court in round 2, leading many. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and everyone on the political spectrum from left to center to right was predicting the death of affirmative action based on the fact that this court had taken this case a second time. I think they're flat wrong, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But it is remarkable that you've got a court that is looking hard at the identically same record in a period of 2 years. You don't see that every day. So here's the composition of the court. We've been talking a lot about the cases. This will just give you a feel for those of you who are court watchers of where the court sat in terms of the Grutter majority upholding the law school plan in 2003, the Gratz majority striking down the mechanical use of race in the undergraduate policy. Justice O'Connor at the time was the swing justice, agreeing with each majority in her own way. Then we have this Picks case that I referenced, and seriously, if you have not read the case, you don't need to know the facts, and you don't need, frankly, to read Roberts or the dissent. Justice Kennedy is the interesting one in the Picks case, because Roberts basically says on behalf of, I think, 4 justices, the way to get beyond discrimination is to move beyond race and to pretend like race doesn't matter. He literally would have wiped race off the map in that context. And Kennedy said, you have lost your mind. So Kennedy, for a moment, reads like this raging liberal until he gets to the question of means, and then he turns back to the big bad conservative. He has never upheld in his career a race-conscious anything. But he was not sort of as hard-edged as you might expect. He actually opened the door to say there are a lot of race-sensitive, race kind of policies that school districts might pursue, and he gave a whole litany of what might be done. So he showed an appreciation and a sensitivity to the reality of race in America, and more importantly, the reality of race in education. But he didn't like the policy at issues there, and frankly, neither did I. I thought they were sort of very sort of over the top in terms of mechanical and not tailored in an appropriate fashion. So bad facts make bad law. And then you got the Fisher majority from 2 years ago. So you see this coalition of left, right, and middle, with that being the middle, deciding this case. Justice Ginsburg sort of railing off to the left about how she would uphold the policy based on the record, and Justice Kagan unfortunately being recused from the case because she was Solicitor General when the case first made its way up through the federal courts. And the real loss there is not how she might vote. You could argue about that. She was a law school dean. She was the one person on the court who would actually bring an educational experience, an undergraduate understanding the mechanics and understanding how faculty always get along and agree on everything. She would bring that to the table. And that perspective is lost in this conversation, and I think that's probably a real loss for the court as well. So let's map this against what you now know from soup to nuts about the standards. I'm going to start at the bottom. So the important columns really here are the first Supreme Court column, and that's the second column, and then the fourth, which is where we are today. The big issue before the court was necessity and race-neutral strategies in terms of what the court decided in round one. And it sent it back. The Fifth Circuit said, we actually think there's a lot of evidence of race-neutral strategies, and it went on for pages. I will tell you, I come at these issues as the modestly conservative, objective reviewer. That's my job. That's the lens I try to apply. And so I'm not easily persuaded by lots of smoke and mirrors. I thought the record on race-neutral strategies was remarkable. I thought Texas hit it out of the park. And no surprise, the plaintiffs have minimized the question of race-neutral strategies and the necessity issue on the second round of appeal. It's almost an afterthought at the end of the brief. They've changed their focus from the question of means, which was ostensibly the only issue the court sent it back down on. I'm wondering, I'm not a sort of Supreme Court sort of practice guru, I'm wondering if the court might say, this is the only issue we're considering, but it's not the way the briefs are going. The issue they're now raising is the fact that the real articulation of the benefits of diversity and the rationale for considering race to achieve those educational benefits of diversity have evolved over time, and there's no real authenticity behind the University of Texas's effort. They're saying that Texas went, in essence, from a statewide societal representation discrimination, pick your term, sort of landscape focus, to a we need critical mass of students in small classes of participatory size, sort of the seminar class of 25 and under, which Texas did say that even though we've got 20, remember they've got 20% plus underrepresented minority representation, in those small classes, they weren't getting critical mass. And so for the learning enterprise there, they said, not enough. So that was a big focus in round one. It wasn't the totality of what Texas was saying. And now one of the arguments is the importance of having a diverse class that reflects diversity within diversity. We want Hispanic students and African American students and white students and Native American students who are rich, who are middle class, and who have struggled all their lives, and we want that mix together. I'm simplifying. And the plaintiffs are saying this evolution from something like societal discrimination to classes of participatory size, critical mass, to now diversity within diversity simply means Texas can't figure out what it's trying to achieve, and it's looking for some hook to hang its hat on. So at least as far as the plaintiffs have framed the issue for the second round, it's much more about row one, actually, which has been very minor up to this point. whether there is a precise and solid rationale that would support the Grutter framework. I should also say there was some winking and nodding going on 2 years ago when Fisher was saying, we're not asking this court to overrule Grutter, but if you're going to rule against us, then you must overrule Grutter. They basically said that in their brief. At oral argument, they were asked point blank, and they said, don't overrule Grutter. So there was we wouldn't be unhappy if you did, but we're not really asking for it. This time, I think the brief is actually much more narrow, much more fact-based, frankly, a better job than they did the last time. And there is no hint that they are asking the court to overrule Grutter. But there are a number of amicus briefs that have been filed on the side of Fisher challenging things that are not actually squarely present at issue in the case writ large, and a number are suggesting that the Grutter framework simply won't stand the test of time. So if you go back to the slides where I had Kennedy in red and those sort of hints, it raises the question, even if Fisher isn't asking for it now, how much of an issue is this really? I don't think anyone really knows, but I would tell you, if you take cases at face value, which you can sometimes do and sometimes not, as you well know, this should not be a case where the legitimacy of Grutter is opened up, because we've got Bakke, Grutter, Gratz, and 2 years ago, 7 members of the court in Fisher. So they're going to upset something pretty profound, which was one of the arguments I'm writing, if they tried to take on a regime that they've really endorsed and set the stage for institutional reliance for years. So what are the outcomes? It covers the range. You could certainly get a win. A tie, remember, with Kagan recused would be a win for the University of Texas if it could get 4 votes. They could conceivably return it to the Fifth Circuit. But you could have something as dramatic as a reversal of the case, ruling against Texas, and wiping out the entire regime of case law. I think that's less likely. I think, there's certainly arguments to be made. This court, I've heard people say this court didn't take this case to affirm the Fifth Circuit. Be that as it may, that doesn't mean it's taking a case to wipe out decades of precedent or an existing regime. And even the Fifth Circuit, in its opinion, recognized the unique nature of the facts of this case. Remember, you've got this 10% plan that is unlike anything any other state or institution is subject to. So it could come out with a decision that is adverse to Texas, but limited to the facts of the case and sort of less dramatic. So just a consideration of spectrums. Real quickly, I won't go into the details here, but just so it's on your radar, the fun has not stopped. In November of 2014, we got 2 cases filed, one at Harvard, one at the University of North Carolina, seeking to declare race-conscious admissions policies unlawful, and both are at the outset now, unlike Fisher, unlike Gratz, unlike Grutter, asking the court to overrule precedent as fundamentally unworkable. You've got, in the Harvard case, complaints about the adverse impact of race-conscious practices on Asian American students. So it's an interesting sort of shift in strategy in terms of how they're approaching the case. UNC is a claim about adverse impact on white and Asian American applicants. So very sort of numbers focused. Again, test scores plus grades equals merit. You all know the drill. Nothing could be further from the truth, but that's sort of the lens by which these complaints are being driven. And you'll see a lot of focus on the race-neutral piece picking up on Fisher. I know I'm relatively certain, I'm not remembering which one standing here. One of the two cases has been stayed pending the second round at Fisher. It wouldn't surprise me for both, frankly, for courts just to say, stop the presses until the Supreme Court resolves the issue in Fisher. And this is just as a reminder for a number of you, it's not just the court of law, it's the court of public opinion. We've got some voter initiatives in a number of states. I've got some resources at the end that you can turn to. But there are a number of states that for public institutions, and the voter initiatives apply to public institutions only, cannot consider race and ethnicity in enrollment practices, among other things there. So don't lose sight of that. All right, let's spend about 10 minutes on practice pointers and resources, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. I wanted to hit a couple of very top-line points, and these are not terribly linear. They're sort of all over the map. But as I was reflecting on what might be interesting takeaways for you in a very practical way, given all that is going on, I thought these might be helpful. So the first is language matters. If you do nothing else, go back and do an audit of your website and your policies, and every reference to affirmative action, wipe it out. We are not talking about affirmative action when we are talking about race-conscious practices to pursue the educational benefits of diversity. I would argue, and I was right until Fisher, and then the court screwed it up, but they didn't listen to me. I would argue that the term affirmative action applies to those remedial efforts, the efforts to correct for past wrongs, and that a forward-looking, mission-driven set of goals shouldn't be tagged with that label. And even if you don't buy that argument, if I pass out a piece of paper and had everyone in this room define affirmative action, I bet we'd have 50 definitions when all was said and done, which means as a practical matter on institution, on campus, it is a term that creates confusion. It generates more heat than light, and frankly isn't helpful. So I would say look long and hard about your terminology. The educational benefits of diversity and critical mass, really important to understand the Grutter framework that can be adapted both at an institutional level and at a school level. The medical schools, for instance, have done a lot of work on this front to adapt the Grutter framework to a health care focus as they are defining mission and then defining the need for race-conscious practices. Critical mass, make sure you understand this one really big takeaway. Critical mass is not about a numbers focus in the context of your student service area. I'm a state flagship institution, and therefore I need proportionality in terms of my student population. It is a number, or not even a number, it is a range toward a set of educational goals and outcomes, back to the point we started with, that you are trying to achieve. Texas had 20%, and they're saying that's not enough because there's stuff not happening in our small classes that should be. And we need more racial diversity as a consequence. So there's more in the materials that I'll give you citations to, but it's an important conceptual hook to make sure you're aware of. And then my personal favorite, race conscious, race sensitive, race blind, race aware, race exclusive, you name it. Do your audit of your policies, frankly, just to see how inconsistent your words are. But more to the point, I want to make sure that we are very clear about what the court, which is not very clear, says about these issues, this terminology. Because so much of this entire conversation hinges on, is my practice race neutral or race conscious? That's right, the core question before you then say, am I subject to strict scrutiny? Do I need to be able to answer all these questions? Well, there is no good universal definition that the Supreme Court has put out that is clearly governing. But what I will tell you, and there's a white paper in the resources you'll see in a minute, we did sort of extensive research across a body of case law, coupled with work that came from the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, to basically settle on the proposition, and I think this is as right as we can know it right now, but I think it could change tomorrow, that a neutral policy is neutral in both intent and operationally. That you've got to actually have an authentic educational goal that might be to serve low-income kids. Maybe I'm going to get lots of racial diversity by virtue of that targeted recruitment practice. That's okay. But I've got an authentic, neutral goal as a foundation that is driving the policy, and that it's neutral in effect. A little counterintuitively, there are recruitment and outreach policies that are actually race-focused. I want more minority students coming to my campus. I am therefore going to target more inner-city high schools or areas of the state that are historically underserved that have large minority populations. Race is in that conversation, but the court would say, I think, as long as the practice is inclusive, you're not conferring a material benefit, you're simply expanding the pool and going out and looking to recruit others, that's probably a race-neutral practice under federal law. By contrast, and this goes back to a point we made early on, racial classifications involve this tangible benefit to an individual student, or they may be neutral on their face, but if they are sufficiently motivated by a racially discriminatory purpose and it leads to some racial benefit, it might be considered race conscious. And so that last one is the really big one, to make sure that you or staff that you are working with is not assuming, because race is not on the face of the policy, that it ipso facto is not race conscious. It requires more of an understanding and analysis of the policy. And the best example is the Texas 10% plan. Look at O'Connor. So this is the exhibition of this court has not figured out what's race neutral and what's race conscious. Justice O'Connor, in the Grutter case, when she was talking about race neutral strategies, and a big issue was everyone should be using percent plans, she said, even assuming they are race neutral, that's a sort of passing, phrase from her. It's a loaded term. There's actually a law review, one of the best law review articles on the topic I've ever read, written by a former Scalia clerk, who says, I think pretty convincingly, the Texas 10% plan, if analyzed under existing precedent, would be considered race conscious, not race neutral, which is the irony of ironies in the context of what we're talking about right now. And that's not at issue in the Fisher case squarely, but it simply is a good mental flag to say, don't judge a book by its cover when you're thinking about the labels of race conscious and race neutral. And you'll see some of the other colorful language that the justices have used. Interestingly, I know this because I was reading this last night, Justice Kennedy in Picks used the term race sensitive to talk about his practices. So they don't even have agreement on the court about what it is exactly they're talking about. This may be something that surfaces at some point. But the rules I just articulated in the prior slide are, I think, the best bottom line we can know for right now. So another practice point, alignment matters. This is really the policy pyramid I actually use at every institution I go to when I go behind closed doors and say, okay, now let's talk truth. It is understanding the need to align goals, objectives, and strategies, that you're talking the benefits of diversity at the top of the pyramid, but there are elements that require operationalization and benchmarking in your objectives. And that, importantly, we haven't talked a lot about this question of strategies, and I did mention earlier the need to consider race neutral fully, just like you do race conscious. It's bigger than an admissions question. You will see this in the record in Texas now. You will see it in some other briefs that are being filed. This is about looking at recruitment, outreach, financial aid, the entire enrollment regime, to figure out what limited use of race might be appropriate in any facet of that enterprise. And so you've got to look at the full inventory, you've got to have underlying data and evidence, and needless to say, engaging with the right stakeholders at the institution is important. So Fisher's coming Have you talked to your communications folks on campus about what they're going to say when the decision comes down, or when they start to get questions as the press interest percolates? Just a flag for you to be thinking about that now, with a suggestion. Every institution's got to figure out what the right message is for it, but the kiss of death is to overreach. You might want to think about who on your faculty, who in your leadership, where you conduct outreach, and sort of anticipate the Texas wins, what do we say? Texas loses, what do we say? Texas loses and the entire regime is wiped out, what do we say? Important considerations going forward. And then finally on this front, OCR counts. I think it's sometimes easy to ignore or miss because we're so consumed with the courts and the court watching that this, relatively, I can't even say quiet anymore, agency at the U.S. Department of Education that now handles 10,000 complaints of discrimination a year. When I was there in the late 90s, we had more than we could do then, 5,000 complaints of discrimination. So that's the change in the number. It's a remarkable sort of expansion without, it should be noted, a corresponding expansion in resources. That's not to say I think they do everything right, just to be clear. But I will say this, there have been a couple of notable resolution agreements they have written, and I'm sure you've got as much experience on this as I do. OCR doesn't have a long history of writing long, articulate resolution agreements that would serve as useful guidance in other settings. They've begun in fits and starts to change that practice. I think they're sort of picking their cases strategically would be my guess. And this one, decided after Fisher, is a remarkable case of Title VI compliance. And I'm not going to get into a lot of the details now. It's on their website. But I just want to flag for you that there are a couple of things in the description, and it's a very thoughtful, well articulated description of Rice policies that you should be thinking about as you consider whatever may be relevant to you in your diversity context. A remarkably deliberative and inclusive process that included the faculty, included the president, included the board. And as we think about the limited deference you do get under an academic freedom regime, I think you want as much of that sort of faculty infusion and cohesion to the extent you can find it in this context. So sort of just a remarkable sort of starting point for the policy itself. Critical mass on the issue that I frankly was about to give up on because I think it's the hardest question around. Rice actually, now they've got the luxury, they've got these 11 different schools, but they were able to articulate a critical mass-like rationale and not only say, are we looking at numbers in the entering class, but those numbers are tied to educational outcomes that we will actually see through within each of these colleges because there are going to be certain classes, these clusters experience together. There are going to be certain experiences, these clusters experience together. So they're actually carrying the education proposition of the theory behind critical mass in a remarkable way, in a way that, frankly, lots of institutions couldn't, given their design. But it's an important and a thoughtful way to understand the concept. And then, lastly, their race-neutral inventory. I mean, this is in the heels of Fisher. Everything's about race-neutral this, race-neutral that. How robust is it? And I throw this slide up for you not to read it, but this is literally the summary of their race-neutral outreach and recruitment policies and practices, their admissions policies and practices, and their financial aid policies and practices that were documented as a foundation for achieving the diversity they were seeking that still did not yield enough to then justify the use of race. So it's a remarkable picture in a nutshell. There is, since that time, and I just haven't done my homework to do the slides on it yet, the OCR resolved a case involving Princeton. And she was absolutely, see that one is remarkable for It's discussion of the holistic review process and the articulation of how to really think about holistic review, and I think a way consistent with Justice Powell's opinion in Bakke and Justice O'Connor's opinion in Grutter. So let me just flag for you some reference materials. College Board and ACE, along with us, published in May a syllabus for diversity programs for colleges and universities. It's literally a compendium broken down by the issue areas in the way that if you were going to structure a policy design at your institution, you would structure it. So basically what we did was capture sort of our 20 years of work and then attempt to identify with some other colleagues what are the best practical resources that will help you on policy design, that will help you on mission language, that will help you on thinking through critical mass, that will help you on race-neutral alternatives and the like. So you've got that resource. The playbook published by the College Board in October of last year is actually a resource that we expect to grow over time that gives you a starting point on race-neutral alternatives. The simple theory being how absurd it is for every institution to have to reinvent a wheel on race-neutral alternatives when there is at least a known body that can serve as your baseline for evaluation. And so that's the starting point there. The Access and Diversity Collaborative, some of you may be familiar with, has numerous resources on across the board, as does, you can go to the AAAS website, launched a project several years ago focused on diversity in STEM that included faculty issues and included both practical guidance and some very lawyer-to-lawyer dense stuff for those of you who are masochists. And I say that with no offense to the writing because I was part of it, but it's heavy. But resources for you there as well. All right, I'm going to stop there, and we've got about 35 minutes for Q&A. And I'll sit down so you can tell me what I missed, and we'll join in the conversation.
Thank you, Art. So we have in the room a couple of microphones, and because, among other reasons, we are being streamed live to folks out there in the world, if you have a question, I'm going to ask that you raise your hand, and one of our assistants will bring a microphone to you. And if there are no hands being raised and no there. Anne?
Excellent presentation, Art. I really admire your work in this area. Help me bridge the gap between institution-centric, very locally driven analysis and playbooks and strategies drawn from elsewhere.
It's a very good, very practical question. My basic operating premise, and it has been for, I started to say years, I could say decades now, I guess, is that going through the drill, whatever the nature of the beast may be on a particular campus, you're not engaging in an enterprise much unlike writing a dissertation. You've got your very specific proposition to prove. You've got to establish your policy parameters and the rationale behind your policy parameters. But it doesn't mean you can't beg, borrow, and steal from good research and good foundations from others. So I think it is not as simple as, oh, they've done it over there, therefore I can do it here. That will not cut it. And let me be very clear, actually, and it's a great question on multiple levels. There are a number of institutions that assume because the Supreme Court in the Michigan cases said the educational benefits of diversity are compelling, that they are done with that point of the analysis. And what I want to tell you is I think nothing could be further from the truth. What they did was say the educational benefits of diversity are compelling, as Michigan demonstrated for the University of Michigan Law School. Now other institutions, you want to make it compelling, then make it your own. So I think there are these core principles and these foundations that are adaptable to institutions, but they're going to be, institutions where things work and things don't. And I think you've got to have that deliberation, and I think in a post-Fisher world, lawyers may differ on this, but I think a documentation of what you considered and rejected and why, because I think the rationales behind, I didn't pursue that because I didn't think it would work, it's not just because I didn't think it would work. I've got some evidence and some logic and some foundations for making that judgment is probably a smart idea. So get to it.
Before we go to the next question, just want to follow up, if I may, just get a sense of who all's here. How many of you are from institutions that have deliberately undertaken this exercise of creating a diversity rationale? Courtney and I are from the same school, so it's not an easy thing to do. So, don't be daunted by it. But and how many public institutions? Okay. Private? Okay. Thank you.
Hi. Just first want to say this case got me really into these kind of topics. This is one of the reasons why I'm here today. I actually went to the University of Texas at Austin in 2007. Heard all about Fisher and yeah, anyway, just that's an aside. This is a little bit broader, not so much a practical kind of question, but you said that UT kind of hit it out of the park with a couple of things with the last briefings and everything. What's your overall opinion going into number 2? How prepared? How you feel it's going to go? I know you said it hinges on Kennedy. What are some of the things that y'all are working on to kind of see where he's going to go, like hit some of the things he was talking about?
Your starting point with Kennedy, so I think Texas has actually done a remarkably good job, given their facts, of making their case on several dimensions. I think including appropriately and rightly sort of rejecting the simplistic notion that critical mass is simply about a number or a range without more. That said, it's Kennedy, and he's never upheld a race-conscious anything. And so am I going to wake up the day after the decision and read the headlines and be shocked that he voted to strike down the practice? No. I would hope maybe he would see an avenue potentially not to do that in this case. For me, the issue is really if in fact, I think you've got 4 justices that are going to go negative on Texas. It's just sort of inconceivable they wouldn't. So that's why he's the game in town. I would hope at a minimum, if it is an adverse ruling, it's a limited ruling given the highly unique facts of the case, and that it doesn't do damage to what I think is a pretty, frankly, rigorous regime that institutions are authentically pursuing around the country.
So I think with the Fisher case, we're in the first sort of stage of seeing how closely courts are going to look at a school's practices and policies. And there was earlier on this notion that, well, it'd be great if the courts give deference to institutional judgments, the way they give deference to academic freedom. But at least right now, that's not the case. There's going to be this exercise that we know the trial courts will be watching very closely, how hard they're going to put your schools through the ringer to see how well their diversity rationale is supported by evidence and by process.
Let me ask a question of the group just to follow up on your questions of who's in the room. Raise your hands. How many in the room are from institutions that have race-conscious either admissions or financial aid policies and practices? Right. So not a lot. Not a lot. Okay.
So the plaintiffs, the Fisher and her team, are letting go of this notion that they want the court to outright strike any kind of race consciousness or awareness sensitivity. They're not asking anymore for Grutter to be overruled. But might it be, Art, that what they're really trying to do is to make it impossible to comply with Grutter? They may be on board by saying, yeah, in theory, you can have a race-conscious or a race-sensitive, whatever set of practices, but in practice, we're going to look at them so closely, and we're going to scrutinize your evidence so carefully that you're never going to be able to satisfy us that this wasn't done for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the things I've heard actually a couple of times is a concern that they could still, in name, uphold Grutter, but continue the trend of Fisher, which is in the underpinnings of it, make it even more challenging. So where the courts pretty much said, deference to you on defining mission and goals, as long as you've got sort of a principled articulation of that, one could envision, well, I now want to see evidence and research that supports your articulation of diversity-related goals, that support race-conscious practices. And so I think there's some concern that the way the plaintiffs have positioned round two with this focus back on ends, in effect, not means, that it may open the door to some of that.
And if the University of Texas was so diligent and, in your view, so successful in generating a strong, evidence-based, honest, and very, very thorough rationale, and if they lose at the Supreme Court, then does any other school have any hope of being able to do better than that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Texas has its challenges, right? And I think that the optics of I'm already at 25% of underrepresented minority students as a starting point to then justify more race-conscious practice is a very unique position for an institution to be in. And so I think there are, despite how well the case I think has been defended and the thrust of the arguments made, there are some unique features in Texas that I think are particularly challenging that may not be true across the board.
So even if Texas loses, they may still be okay in terms of the ultimate composition of their student body?
Yeah. Now, they would tell you they are not okay because they are not seeing the benefits surface in certain facets of student engagement that they are looking for. But from a sort of broad top-level numbers standpoint, yeah, but that's demographics in action plus the 10% plan. That's what it got you. Yes, sir.
Hi. This has been going on so long, I forget when this issue was raised, but I thought the plaintiff in Fisher's point was that not that she didn't get accepted under the 10% rule, but that she didn't get accepted in that second tier.
That's correct.
With the additional
That
race.
is correct. So the
is that the issue that's before
yes.
in Fisher?
So to be clear, the 10% plan is not technically at issue in the case. That's not being challenged. What's being challenged is, if you remember, it's the 10% plan and then 20% of the class was admitted through this set of factors that included race. The fact that race was considered for the remaining 20% of the class is what she argues knocked her out of a position that she was entitled to.
And another question.
And by the way, she's now graduated from LSU Law School. So there's a question of standing, but Texas has lost that at every turn.
Do they lose that on sort of like on a Bakke issue that it's capable of being repeated?
It's not entirely clear to me exactly. I can't figure that one out. It's in my too hard to handle box, frankly.
And another question, nobody else has one. Why doesn't Texas argue that we have 20%, but if we don't continue with that, then we only have 20% by having this regime in place. So therefore, the 20% isn't going to be there permanently. I mean, if they were to stop doing it, why wouldn't it go back to 10 or 8 or whatever?
The short answer is I don't know the answer to your question, but my strong suspicion would be, A, they were getting the 20% without the race-conscious practice. They were getting the 20% with the 10% plan based on the segregation of the high schools. So their starting point was, we're already at 20%, right? And then you got the sort of changing demographics that in Texas, I'm assuming, like the rest of America, the sort of the browning of America. And so the numbers are even getting more dramatic from a larger percentage of underrepresented minorities. My guess is the facts wouldn't support that argument. Ann?
How do you were saying that a wholesale wipe away is unlikely. how does that approach square with O'Connor's, well, 25 years might be enough? You know, if we're going to be done in 25 years, why not be done in 1 year?
I have a closet full of broken crystal balls, to be clear. I have always considered, and I've tried to look as objectively as I can at sort of every word on the opinion as well as the work I do with institutions. I have, from the get-go, viewed that line as a quintessential throwaway line that made no sense. It is fun, forget whatever the issue is. This has nothing to do with pro-diversity or not, or pro-race consciousness or not. The Constitution does not flip a switch on December 31st, ever. And so the notion that yesterday it was okay, but tomorrow ipso facto, without any further analysis, it's not, is completely inconsistent with the constitutional regime I think we have. My personal take, and I bring part of this is my 6+ years of enforcement, being everyone's friend from the federal government, on this set of issues, is a real frustration that after 25 years of a sort of Bakke being the pole star of analysis, institutions had not really rolled up their sleeves to do the heavy lifting, and I think that is a fair indictment. I think the first 25 years we were sitting back on our laurels. I think Grutter and Gratz were a kind of wake-up call and moved the ball substantially forward, but my personal view, and maybe it's just my lens creeping into her words, was get your act together. And this was sort of that sort of dangling line. I think, if I'm correct, she was quoted subsequent to leaving the court and saying that line was a mistake.
So if the decision comes out at the end of June, then many or all of us will be scrambling at that point to figure out what to do in response to it. There'll be a cottage industry of consultants and lawyers and others who will be there to help. But between now and then, obviously we're all eagerly awaiting what the Supreme Court's going to do with this Fisher case, but what do schools do in the meantime? Are we really just held hostage, or is there some practical way to get through the next year? Or does it even matter for those of you who are admissions officers? You've already got your plans in place and are not going to change course between now and next June.
I think that fundamentally that's right. The trains are still moving, and heaven help you trying to stand in the way of an admissions officer who's got deadlines to meet and goals to. So those trains can and should keep moving. And I've had lots of conversations with in-house counsel, some of whom say, I'll worry about it when it comes down. Others saying, what prudently can I do now? I tend to like the latter, not the former, because I'm kind of always be prepared kind of guy. I think at a minimum, this question of inventory is really important. The institutions that I've been part of the exercise of, if you're focused on it, odds are you're 80% there in some form or fashion, as a sort of broad generalization. But if you actually haven't documented everything that might be effective, then what about that policy that's out there that's being administered by someone who's not connected to this department that no one knows about? That is your lawsuit that is waiting to happen. And I think paying attention, getting people together to say, we're not going to go through the rather extensive, at least for initial rounds, review and analysis of everything, but let's at least know what we've got and what we've got, so the table is set when the opinion comes down, that you are then ready to move in whatever direction you need to move.
Another question for the audience. Anyone here represent an institution that has open admissions, that there is no screening? Any comments on how that has worked for you over a period of time, or in terms of diversity?
I doubt I'm the right. I've only been with my institution for a year, and I've not dealt with admissions, so I'm probably not the best to answer that.
I presume that would be a very different theoretical place to be if the admissions were totally open. Seeing no further questions, I want to thank Art for his presentation. I would remind everyone here, if you would, be so kind as to fill out the evaluation forms. Forgive me, I don't recall exactly how you do that, but I think by the end of the session, by the end of the conference, we will have learned. I imagine it's done online in some fashion, but please do share your opinion of our topic and of our speaker, and look forward to seeing you at other sessions. Enjoy the rest of the conference.